So welcome everybody to, this is an Insider Bonhoeffer reference for those of you who are Bonhoeffer scholars, because our speaker today is one. This is our penultimate lecture in the series. We welcome today Dr. Mike Mawson for our topic. Dr. Mawson is Senior Lecturer in Systematic Theology and Ethics and a Research Fellow in the Public and Contextual Theology Research Center at Sturt University in Australia. And he's published a number of books. Again, I will just keep that information for you to peruse on our webpage to keep the introduction short. But certainly one of them is a very good book on Bonhoeffer's early theology. And what is even more important is that two things, that one, that Mike actually comes to us from Australia. So he's at a very early morning hour. Many thanks, Mike, for that, for doing that for us. And secondly, aside from the whole title, he's just a really good theologian whom I've come to appreciate over the years, part of our research group. And he will speak today to us on living in the midst of death, theological reflections on aging and technology. And as every time, if you have questions during his lecture, feel free to put them in the chat box. If there is time at the end, we will start reading out those questions and Mike will try to answer them. So Mike, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for joining us and show us what you have.
Thank you, Jens. Hi, everyone. It's welcome. It's wonderful to be here. I made a slight change to the title of my paper. So the main title is the same, Living in the Midst of Death, but I've changed the subtitle to Theological and Philosophical Reflections on Aging and Identity. I do have a PowerPoint. It's somewhat minimal, so it's just a few slides that capture some of the main points in each section. And Kathy is also going to paste a document in chat, which has all of the main quotes I'm using for those who want to follow along. It's a reasonably dense paper, but in the conclusion, I'll sort of step back and just summarize some of the main points and also draw out what's at stake with some of what I'm covering. Okay. How's that? Can you see okay?
Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Mawson. I just wanted to say to you and everybody, my apologies, but apparently the function for sharing that document is not actually enabled in this meeting. So unfortunately, I'm not able to share that document with the quotations at this time.
No problem, and I'm happy to make it available afterwards. So let me begin. In recent years, there's been a growing body of research aiming to understand the mechanisms that underlie aging in order to extend the human lifespan. And this research has sought to understand the processes of biological deterioration that begin in human beings at the age of reproductive maturity, and to explore new and emerging therapies and interventions that might intervene or even reverse these aging processes. In his 2019 bestseller, Lifespan, Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to, the Harvard geneticist David Sinclair has surveyed some of the most promising results and discoveries of this research. He identifies and describes the therapies and technologies that he thinks most likely to contribute to longer lifespans. And he includes here AMPK activators, TOR inhibitors, sirtuin activators, NAD boosters, rapalogs, and senolytics. Thanks to the technologies I've described, Sinclair reflects a prolonged, healthier lifespan is inevitable. How and when we'll achieve this is a bit less certain, although the path is clear. So at least by Sinclair's estimation, we're fast approaching a time when aging, which he calls the mother of all diseases, will at last be cured. If the research that Sinclair surveys is in one sense scientific, his reflections locate him as part of a broader anti-aging movement that's emerged over recent years. And Sinclair stands alongside a number of other advocates for curing aging, many of whom express similar levels of confidence that this goal will soon be achieved. Indeed, Aubrey de Grey, one of the movement's more colourful advocates, has speculated that the first humans who will live for 1,000 years are already amongst us, perhaps some of us in this group. And this is because of what de Grey calls longevity escape velocity. And this simply means that as new therapies and technologies continue to emerge and progress, they'll begin extending the lifespan at a rate that outpaces our aging itself. So, if Sinclair and de Grey are correct, and if we are indeed on the threshold of significantly longer lifespans, then this scenario poses a number of ethical challenges. One such challenge relates to justice and equity. As these therapies and technologies develop, how do we ensure their equitable distribution? How do we ensure that extended lifespans do not simply become the domain of the rich and powerful? And when this question was put to the venture capitalist and anti-aging proponent Peter Thiel, his response was largely dismissive. So he said, probably the most extreme form of inequity is between people who are alive and people who are dead. A second challenge relates to population growth and its impact. So if the predicted scenario comes to pass, extended lifespans will lead to a dramatic increase in the global population. And this in turn will place pressure on resources in our already fragile environments. Anti-aging advocates have responded to concerns about the impact of population in various ways. Some have expressed confidence in technology or human ingenuity. So we'll find ways of solving problems of scarcity and environmental degradation as they emerge. Others have suggested that these problems themselves are not as pressing as we might think. So as Bill Andrews of the biotech company Sierra Science has speculated, even if we stop aging today, it's going to be a long time before we have real overload. Maybe 50 years. It gives us time for people to find other planets to migrate to. A final ethical challenge relates to what we might call the normative implications of extended lifespans. Would we still be recognizably human without the familiar constraints of aging, frailty, and mortality? How would the lack or diminishment of such constraints impact our ability to flourish as human beings? So would extended lifespans, for example, mitigate the ways we currently are formed within and by relationships of deep dependence? Would the diminishment of aging and death impact our ability to formulate plans or invest ourselves in projects? And again, many anti-aging advocates have not taken these kinds of concerns especially seriously. So when asked whether an extended life would lead to boredom, the philosopher John Davis admitted that we may indeed find ourselves in need of diversions. And to quote, those of us who feel blue at 502 may just need a change of scenery or a new hobby. And if those don't work, a 31st century boredom pill. Okay, so these kind of comments all suggest a certain naivety on the part of many prominent anti-aging advocates. And without claiming that every advocate shares these views, such comments indicate a broader failure of this movement to grapple with or acknowledge the extent of these challenges. And furthermore, I'd suggest they indicate a deeper failure to grapple with or recognise what human beings are. These advocates assume that human identity and meaning can exist in abstraction from the material, biological, and temporal ways in which we currently inhabit the world. And in particular, they assume that radically extended lifespans, more life with less aging and death, they assume that we can have radically extended lifespans, more life with less aging and death, without this fundamentally impacting who we are and how we experience this world. So in this lecture tonight, I aim to interrogate these assumptions primarily by engaging two different accounts of what it means to be human in the midst of aging and suffering. So in the first section, I'll engage Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theological account of human beings as fallen creatures, as beings who exist between God's promise of life and curse of death. In the second section, I'll turn to the work of the philosopher Jean Améry, focusing on his phenomenological reflections on the body and identity in aging and decline. And then in my conclusion, I'll return to the anti-aging movement, suggesting how some of these insights from Bonhoeffer and Améry can exist with diagnosing and resisting its naive and utopian tendencies. So section 1, Bonhoeffer's theological anthropology. So one of the striking features of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's theology is his consistent refusal of idealistic forms of thinking. Bonhoeffer is resistant to kinds of speculation and decision-making that stand apart from the specific and concrete ways in which God encounters and determines us as human beings. And in particular, he often identifies this encounter as disclosing to us that we're simultaneously God's creatures and those who have fallen into sin. The encounter with God in Christ discloses our status as sinners. So we only know of sin through our encounter with Christ, but it also discloses that we were not created or intended as such. And the work of theological anthropology for Bonhoeffer is thus about attending to human beings in this twofold form or this twofold status. One place where he sets this out in some detail is his exposition of the opening chapters of Genesis in his book, Creation and Fall. Originally delivered as a set of lectures at Friedrich Wilhelm's University in the winter of 1932-1933, he revised and published the lectures the following year at the request of his students. At just over 100 pages in the most recent German edition, Creation and Fall stands apart in the wider context of early 20th century German biblical theology. So it's a self-consciously ecclesial and proclamatory text, and it displays Karl Barth's influence and sits fairly lightly on wissenschaftlich and historical critical methods. As with Barth's earlier Romans commentary, Bonhoeffer allows the text of scripture itself to guide his reflection. So he just moves through the text of the opening chapters of Genesis, verse by verse, passage by passage, meditating at some length on each given word or phrase. If we step back, Bonhoeffer organizes Creation and Fall around the dual depictions of human beings in Genesis as imago Dei, or the image of God, and sicut Deus, or like God. And in the first half of his treatise, he provides a rich account of human beings as imago Dei. This includes reflections on the earthliness of the first human beings, as well as on how Adam and Eve exist as one another's concrete limit and blessing. And these reflections have received significant attention in subsequent Bonhoeffer scholarship. Less attention, however, is typically paid to the second half of Creation and Fall. And here Bonhoeffer reflects on what it means that we're human beings after the fall, as those who assert ourselves as sicut Deus, which he defines as humankind like God, in knowing out of its own self about good and evil, and having no limit, and acting out of its own resources, in its society, and its being alone. So in other words, for Bonhoeffer, after the fall, we're no longer simply those created as imago Dei. We're now also those striving to live from ourselves or apart from God. So how does Bonhoeffer unfold his account of these two very different aspects of being human? So central to his exposition is an extended reflection on Genesis 2:8-17. God plants a garden in Eden in the east, in which he places the man, or Adam. At the center of this garden, God plants two trees, promising to the man that if he should eat from the tree of knowledge, then he will surely die. And as Bonhoeffer reflects, this prohibition from God means nothing other than this. Adam You are who you are because of me, your creator, so now be what you are. And by giving Adam this concrete boundary or limit, thou shalt not eat, God has affirmed Adam in his status as a dependent, contingent creature. And before the fall, as Bonhoeffer writes, Adam understands this prohibition and the threat of death only as a renewed gift, as the grace of God. And even when God pronounces that transgressing this limit will lead to death, Adam understands this prohibition and the threat of death only as a renewed gift. Yet, as we know, within just a few short verses, Adam and Eve will indeed transgress this God-given limit. And this transgression will change everything. The prohibition that Adam heard and obeyed as grace becomes the law that provokes wrath in human beings and God. So with the fall into sin, God's promise or prohibition is no longer experienced as a means of God's grace, but now as judgment and law. So after the fall, Adam's very creatureliness, his dependence on God and others, is now experienced as a threat and a burden. For Bonhoeffer, as for Luther before him, it's significant that the question of how this transgression could come about is never really addressed in the biblical text. Instead, we just get this strange story of Eve's encounter with a talking serpent. And the sheer incomprehensibility of the fall is conveyed in this indirect manner by means of a new question posed by God, one of God's own creatures. And even this new question doesn't really make sense. Did God say, you shall not eat from any tree in the garden? And Walter Brueggemann has commented on this passage. The serpent grossly misinterprets God in 3:1 and is corrected by the woman in verses 2 and 3. But the misquotation has opened up a consciousness of the possibility of an alternative way to God. From that point on, things become distorted. And what's significant for Bonhoeffer, in line with Brueggemann's comment, is that the serpent's question opens up a different way of thinking and speaking in relation to God. That is, the question itself proposes speaking about God in the abstract or in the third person, rather than as speaking to God or as speaking before God. As Bonhoeffer writes, this kind of thinking and speaking passes over and reaches behind God or the concrete givenness of God's command. It's a new grammar, it's a new way of speaking, and this opens the space within which the serpent can insert its counter-promise. You'll not die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be like God, Zichut Deus, and know what good and evil is. So it's only once Adam and Eve had entered into this new grammar, or this different way of thinking, that transgressing God's command even becomes conceivable. And this indicates the very core of Bonhoeffer's theological anthropology. These two promises, God's promise to Adam, if you eat, you shall die, and the serpent's promise to Eve, you shall not die. These promises disclose the situation of the first human beings and thus all subsequent humanity. So this is a story about us, who we are and where we are. These two promises disclose what it means to be human beings between the fall and the eschaton. As Bonhoeffer reflects, you shall not die at all, you shall die. These two statements mark the cleavage that now splits the world apart for Adam. So following Bonhoeffer's exposition, we too exist and can understand ourselves only in terms of the dialectic of these two promises. You know, both these promises are found in Scripture, both God's promise and the serpent's promise, and both are therefore part of God's word or God's revelation to humanity. And so Bonhoeffer observes that what God promised to Adam in the garden is what came to pass. So rather than suggesting that God relented following Adam and Eve's transgression, and many interpreters of Genesis go down this line, Bonhoeffer instead insists that the first human beings really did die. What does it mean to be dead, he writes? It does not mean the abolition of one's being a creature. Instead, it means no longer being able to live before God, but having to live before God. It means receiving life from God no longer as grace coming from the center and the boundary of one's own existence, but as a commandment that stands in one's way. So having transgressed God's command, Adam and Eve lose God as the center of their existence in life. And thus, in a very real sense, they lose themselves. Instead of knowing themselves within God, they now know themselves as their own origin. And in Bonhoeffer's reading, only the language of death does justice to the nature and extent of this loss. As he poetically puts it, Adam has ingested death into himself. Adam is dead before he dies. On the other hand, this situation of a living dead, or being dead before you die, indicates that the serpent's promise to Eve has also been fulfilled. You'll not die at all. Your eyes will be opened and you'll know what good and evil is. So with their transgression, the first human beings continue to live, and they live with their with their promised knowledge of good and evil. And indeed, in Bonhoeffer's reading, part of God's judgment and curse on Adam and Eve is precisely that they do continue to live in this new situation as those who have ingested death. He writes, humankind must live in the fallen world. Humankind gets what it wants, that is the curse. And for Bonhoeffer, this paradoxical situation of a living death or a cursed creation is central for how all human beings experience themselves. We want to live, we're unable to live, having to live. That's the way in which humankind, sequat deus, is dead. So he describes it as a kind of split existence. Humankind cannot get back behind its split state to unity. It is no longer unambiguously to distinguish the light of Lucifer, the light bearer, from the light of God. Humankind remains in the twilight. Yet rather than acknowledging this twilight, we remain in denial, or we look for a means of escape. So like Adam and Eve, we too strive to flee from God and ignore this new reality. Humankind, which has fallen away from God in a plunge, now still flees from God. For humankind, the fall is not enough. Bonhoeffer is clear, however, that God doesn't simply abandon Adam and Eve or ourselves to this continuing attempt at flight. God encounters and addresses us in the midst of our sin. He writes, God accepts human beings for what they are, fallen creatures, and affirms them in their fallenness. God's action accompanies human beings on its way. And as we learn from Genesis, God addresses human beings by ordering and preserving their life. By making cloaks for human beings, God shows them their wickedness, shows them that it is their wickedness that makes this necessary. God's way of acting to preserve the world is to affirm the sinful world and show it its limits by means of order. Ultimately, and just as this is the last point on Bonhoeffer, ultimately as Christians, we hold that God also encounters and addresses this fallen creation in a new way. So Christ's work on the cross brings about new life, but it does so in the midst of human suffering and this living death. With Christ's death, God's entered into and rewritten the story of the fall. As Bonhoeffer writes, the trunk of the cross becomes the wood of life. And now in the midst of the world, on the accursed ground itself, life is raised up anew. What a strange paradise is this hill of Golgotha, this cross, this blood, this broken body. What a strange tree of life, this trunk on which the very God had to suffer and die. So on the cross, God meets human beings in the midst of their split or cursed situation. And this means that as Christians, we no longer need fear or flee from suffering and death. our twilight experiences, and our status as fallen creatures. Because of the cross, we know that God and new life are present even here. Okay, so let's now put Bonhoeffer aside, and we'll turn to Jean Améry and his phenomenology, or what I've called his phenomenology of aging. So Bonhoeffer's language of the cross is useful for framing the philosopher Jean Améry's more recent reflections on aging. And to be clear, Améry shares none of Bonhoeffer's theological or Christian commitments. As an Austrian-born Jew and Holocaust survivor, his work is militantly secular. And his writings explore in graphic detail such topics as torture, aging, and suicide. In 1968, he published his short book on aging, Über das Altern, Revolte and Resignation, or on aging, revolt, and resignation. And key to this book, as his English translator observes, is a determination to look at the phenomenon of aging without blinking, to assess it without sentimentalizing, consoling, or mincing words about the horrible nature of what he sees. Améry initially organizes his reflections on aging around a dialectic or opposition between time and space. And bear with me here, because we are going to get a little bit philosophical. Améry's approach differs from Kant's philosophy, where space and time are transcendentals that frame how we experience reality. And his approach also differs from Heidegger's project as a kind of temporalizing of space or being. In contrast to both Kant and Heidegger, Améry situates space and time in terms of our lived bodily experience. And in particular, he contrasts the different ways that we experience space and time when we are old and when we are young. So let's run through that. On the one hand, Améry suggests that when we're young, we primarily experience space or the world as something available to us, something at our disposal. He reflects that one is more likely to say of a young person that the world is open to him. In other words, younger people experience space as possibility, as that which they either own or they can take possession of. You know, you can do anything, you can become anything. Yet for this very reason, Améry continues, younger people lack any real sense of time. To be young is to throw one's body into a time that is not time at all, but life, world, and space. So for those who are young, time remains without substance and significance. You know, it seems endless. It remains in the future. It never presents a limit. As he puts it, time is not a personal problem for anyone who is living for the world. On the other hand, Améry suggests that aging entails a reversal of the situation. So aging involves a loss of space and an accumulation of time. And this is apparent in how older people experience the world as something that eludes them and stands against them. For the old, space or the world is filled with traps and bristles with threats, as Simone de Beauvoir puts it. And along similar lines, Améry provides the example of a man who once enjoyed being in nature. He writes, mountains, valleys, forests he once loved are now to him a club to which he has not been admitted. So as the body ages, space contracts, the world becomes inhospitable. The mountain, laborious to climb, was by this time his anti-ego. So in Améry's understanding, aging removes us from space in the world, throwing us back on ourselves and back into ourselves. As space and the world become inhospitable, we become increasingly isolated and distant from others. And this is because space itself is what mediates our relationships and our connections. Space, even my space, he writes, is always the space of others. So when we're in space, we're always connected to others, an intersubjectively understandable phenomenon. So when we age and begin to lose access to space, we begin to experience social exclusion and marginalization. And on aging, he traces in detail the ways in which the inability of the older person to negotiate space results in their being positioned as old and as irrelevant. Aging as a loss of space entails both social isolation and cultural alienation. Aging not only involves a loss of space, but an accumulation of time. So this is the second part of aging. As we age, time no longer remains distant and in the future, as it does for the young. Rather, we now begin to experience time as something real and substantial, something that's gathering up inside us. As Améry reflects, the old have life behind them, but this life is no longer actually lived. It's nothing but gathered up, passed away. The less time we have before us, the less time we think we have before us, the more time there is in us. As we age, we accumulate or gather up time. An aging human being, as he elsewhere puts it, is a bundle of time or a stratified mass of time. And just to make this more concrete, the sense of time as gathered up or solidified is apparent in how many older people increasingly rely on and live within memories. So as we age, our memories become more important and more real, even as space in the surrounding world recedes and becomes inhospitable. And in particular, Améry reflects on how this withdrawal into memory as gathered up time can become a means of surviving in the midst of social isolation and cultural alienation. In an unfamiliar world of bewildering tastes and fashions, he writes, the wardrobe of yesterday regains its authenticity in memory. So as I mentioned above, Améry situates both this loss of space and this accumulation of time and aging within the experiences of the body. He insisted it's through the experiences of pain and aging that we begin to discover the body. So we discover the body, he writes, in the way that aging heaps burdens upon us frequently every day. It's in its suffering that the body no longer transcends itself and dissolves into space. So in other words, we gain the body, or we become aware of our bodies precisely when they no longer simply mediate the world to us in the ways they once did. You know, the body cuts us off from space with its heavy breathing, painful legs, the arthritically plagued articulation of our bones. And here, just as a passing comment, it's worth noting the difference between Améry and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So for the latter, the body is what opens us up to the world. For Améry, by contrast, the body emerges only in its opposition to space. And those who have got the handout, I've got a couple of quotes that draw that out. This indicates the contradiction that's central to our experiences of aging. Aging gives us the body, it forms us, it presses us back on ourselves, it makes us who we are, but it does so in ways that we neither choose nor desire. We gain the body in aging, but in ways that we often resist and resent. For the aging person, Améry writes, the body is something imposed on them, and yet at the same time, that which is most his own. And as he elsewhere puts it rather succinctly, I am myself through my body and against it. So as we lose access to space, as we accumulate time, the body is becoming our prison, but also our last shelter from an increasingly inhospitable world. And he makes these claims not only about the body, but identity as such. Just as we gain the body through aging, so too do we gain or increase in ego. You know, as he rather poetically puts it, pain and sickness, the purpose of pain and sickness is to ensure that I'm absorbed in the body, and consequently, they reduce to my ability to function, I gain an ego. You know, by becoming separated from the world impressed into their body, impressed into our bodies with their accumulated time, we become familiar with ourselves in a new way. Yet, as we've seen, this newfound familiarity is also alienation. Through aging, we become both more ourselves and less ourselves. Even as we're separated from the world and pressed into the body, we're being positioned by society as old and irrelevant. We don't escape the judgment of others. And this means that there's a continual tension going on between what he calls ego association and disassociation. Who has the final word? The body that brings in aging a new familiarity with themselves, or the society that imposes on every human being an ego that has to stay healthy? And in the final, so just as a final point, in the final essay on aging, Améry frames this contradictory experience of our aging as a kind of living with dying, to use his language. And this is language that resonates with Bonhoeffer, as we've seen. Améry frames bodily aging as an encounter with death in the midst of life. In aging, this dying is also living, just as living is permanent dying. And he elsewhere suggests that one can speak of aging as a stretch of time in which we meet the thought of death. And this language of living with dying conveys the fragmentary nature of our experiences of aging, experiences through which Améry reflects death is already present in us, making room for equivocation and contradiction. We become I and not I. We become more alienated from ourselves and more familiar with ourselves. Sorry, we become I and not I. We become more alienated from ourselves and more familiar with ourselves. Day and night cancel each other out in twilight. Okay, so let me just step back a little and make some comments to draw out why I think Bonhoeffer and Améry can be useful for diagnosing and responding to the claims of anti-aging advocates. In the introduction, I suggested that comments by prominent advocates for curing aging indicate a basic failure to grapple with the ethical implications of extending the lifespan. And I suggested that this in turn indicates a failure to recognise and attend to what human beings are. In significant respects, these advocates assume that curing aging will not fundamentally alter what we are and how we experience the world. As compared with advocates of curing aging, Bonhoeffer and Améry attend much more closely to the complex realities of aging, suffering, and despair. So for both of them, these realities aren't simply problems to be overcome or solved, they're integral to what makes us human. For Améry, as we've seen, aging separates us from the world and forms us as individuals. Through aging, we discover the body and gain an ego, even as we resent and resist this process. For Bonhoeffer, the cross teaches us that God is present and at work in human suffering and dying, meaning that we too should be open and attentive to these as places of God's redemption and new life. And this close attention to suffering makes Bonhoeffer and Améry alert to false forms of consolation and hope. So they're resistant to a temptation to look for quick or easy solutions in the midst of suffering. Améry at one place speaks of the illusory comforts that tempt us when we're old. And he notes especially the escapism offered by religion, which he calls the most beguiling illusion of all. Similarly, Bonhoeffer's critical of otherworldliness in his theology, the ways in which religion can tempt us to try and transcend or escape from the earth and its problems. And their rejection of these temptations, Améry and Bonhoeffer's rejection of these temptations stands in contrast to the extravagant promises and confident predictions of anti-aging advocates. We've also seen that Bonhoeffer and Améry provide rich reflection on the complex relationship between living and dying. For Améry, aging reveals that death is already present in the midst of living. You know, a close attention to aging is captured through this language of living and dying. This presence of death is integral to bodily experience, to memory, to identity. For Bonhoeffer, as fallen creatures, our living and dying are bound together in ways that continually elude us. We exist in the twilight, we exist between God's promise of life and curse of death, meaning that there's no human life without suffering and death. By contrast, advocates for curing aging generally assume that life and death are separate and separable from one another. They're two different things, one over here, another over here. They assume that we can have more of the former and less of the latter. And what I've been suggesting is that both Bonhoeffer and Améry are far less confident that this is the case, that we can sort of separate these out. Similarly, these advocates have a fairly straightforward linear conception of identity. They assume a broadly Cartesian conception of the self, or that we're stable subjects prior to and apart from our bodies and our relationships. And again, in different ways, both Améry and Bonhoeffer contest this assumption. You know, for Améry, it's only through the gathering of time and loss of space that we emerge as individuals. And for Bonhoeffer, we're human beings as limited creatures. You know, we're limited creatures both before and after the fall. We're creatures who exist in dependence upon God, the earth, and one another, whether we like it or not. In contrast to anti-aging advocates, Bonhoeffer and Améry place contradiction or rupture at the heart of identity. For Améry, even as we discover the body in aging and gain an ego, we become alienated from ourselves. The death is already in us, making room for equivocation and contradiction. For Bonhoeffer, as fallen creatures, we're simultaneously Imago Dei and Sicut Deus. We live as people who are split apart within themselves. So for both of them, contradiction or this internal rupture is central to what we are. It's something that we can't get past. It's something that makes us human. Of course, Bonhoeffer also recognizes that this is an intolerable situation and one that we do continually resist. So from Bonhoeffer's standpoint, we might view the proposal to cure aging as one more attempt to overcome the split existence. So in other words, this proposal itself is an expression of our deep desire to live as Sicut Deus, without limits and from our own resources. And here, commenting on Aubrey de Grey, Emory University's Paul Volper has described de Grey's vision as, quote, a male adolescent power fantasy by an evangelist for a religious vision of utopian health. And, you know, just stepping back, it's no accident that many of the prominent proponents of curing aging are venture capitalists, you know, who value, or, you know, libertarians of sorts. So in significant respects, the vision of de Grey and many of these others expresses a deep desire for autonomy and for mastery, an existence without limits and without dependence. And at least for Bonhoeffer, this vision of escaping our split existence and limits is ultimately misguided. And just to close, in a lecture from the same period as Creation and Fall, he reflects on our utopian attempts to move beyond our twilight situation of living death. He writes, "We cannot get beyond our death, our loneliness, and our desire with our utopias. They all belong inextricably to the cursed earth. But, in fact, we are not supposed to get beyond them at all. Rather, the kingdom comes to us in our death, in our loneliness, in our desire. It comes to us where the church perseveres in solidarity with the world and expects the kingdom from God alone." Thank you.